Well, I want to welcome all of you. My name is Fred Logevall, and I'm a historian here at Harvard. I'm at the Kennedy School and also in the history department in the college. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this event with Marvin Kalb, who I will introduce in a moment. And this is featuring, our event is about Marvin's new book, A Different Russia, Khrushchev and Kennedy, and on a collision course. And I want to show the book. It's right here. And it is just a marvelous book. I want to urge you to run, don't walk, run to your nearest bookstore to pick this up. It's the third volume of memoirs, written, I think, over the last 6 or 7 years, published over the last 6 or 7 years, draws on Marvin's record, I guess you could say, that he kept as a CBS correspondent, broadcasts and reports, young journalist stationed in Moscow during the Cold War. And here we're focusing on what the historian Michael Beschloss in his book called The Crisis Years, which I think is an apt title. And that's what, at least in part, we're going to talk about today. I've spent several days now totally immersed in this book. Partly, I think, because I'm a historian of the Cold War, partly for more self-interested reasons, folks, which is that I'm writing a life and times, a multi-volume life and times of one of the people in this story, namely John F. Kennedy. And so this is both sort of research for me, I guess you could say, but also just a pleasure as a student of the Cold War and of good writing. A particular strength, before I introduce Marvin, I just want to mention up front, and I hope maybe we can talk about this a little bit, is that we get such insight in this book and in the previous volumes into Nikita Khrushchev, who led the Soviet Union, as I think you all know, for 10 years. Absolutely fascinating figure in my view, and of course, a historically important figure. And we get here maybe an unsurpassed, for all of the great biographies we have out there, and Marvin relies on them, you get a different perspective here, an insight into Khrushchev's reasoning, based on close observation of Khrushchev, but also direct, I mean, just imagine, direct experience with the leader in the Kremlin. And so it's just a very powerful work. I'm delighted that we can talk about it today, talk about some of the themes. I'll say that the title of the book reflects at least an implicit theme of the book. And I won't say more than that, but we will have to talk about the title. Maybe you can sort of guess what Marvin has in mind with this particular title. But let me just say a few words of introduction. Marvin Kalb is an award-winning writer. He is a journalist. He is former Harvard, he's a Harvard professor emeritus. We didn't overlap here at Harvard, but he was here for very many years. He's a founding director of the Shorenstein Center, which is who's hosting this tonight. So the Shorenstein Center is a jewel at the school, and he was there at the creation of the center. He has covered American election campaigns for decades, of course, and is one of the true giants, as I think you all know, of American journalism in the Cold War, the author of 17 books. And of course, this one that we're discussing today is the most recent of those 17. And maybe the last thing I'll say, I could say much more, but not the least of Marvin's accomplishments is that he managed to get his name added to Richard Nixon's enemies. So I feel compelled to mention this. Marvin, welcome. I'm so delighted to be able to do this with you today, to talk about this extraordinary period in most, not only U.S. history, but in global history, in the middle decades of the middle few years, really, in this particular book, in the 20th century. And I guess where I would start, there's so many different directions we would go, but I'm interested in having you talk a little bit about the writing, maybe not in terms of, words on the page, but one of the things that I think is so extraordinary about the book and its predecessors is the way that it combines memoir and history. So you're able to tell a very personal story, which just comes off the page. But you're also able to give us a chronicle or a narrative of the key events of the period. I'm imagining, Marvin, that the reports for CBS were a very important resource for you as you wrote this book. But talk about that a little bit, or anything else you want to say by way of introduction?
First of all, thank you very, very much, Fred, for the generous comments about me in the book. Yes, it's the 17th. Yes, it's the third memoir that I've done. And what the memoirs embrace really is a reporter's judgment of observation of the Nikita Khrushchev period of Soviet history. And we're talking about the period from about roughly 1955 to 1964, when he was unceremoniously ousted from power. I happen to have lived in Russia for 5.5 of those 9 years. The first year I was there as an attaché at the US Embassy. I did whatever Ambassador Bolin wanted me to do. One of the things he wanted me to do was to go out and meet Russian people, talk to them, find out what's on their minds. We were so absorbed just with reading Pravda and Izvestia, because in those days, Fred, you had very little contact with Russian people because the Russians were frightened of you and they would back off.
Yeah.
But when they knew that, when you were very young, I was 26 at the time, and I spoke Russian, and I knew a good bit about Russian history and literature. And when they sensed that you respected them, that you knew a little bit about their history, indeed you spoke their language, they opened up. And when Russians open up, it is a very emotional opening. Within a matter of a couple of minutes, you get to the heart of a person's thinking. And so I would report back to Bolin and tell him what I thought. At the same time, at night, I wrote notes to myself about significant conversations. Then when I went back to Moscow in 1959 through 63 for CBS News, sent there by a magnificent journalist named Edward R. Murrow, when I arrived in Moscow, the contact that I had made with Khrushchev in that earlier time in 1956-7 carried over. And it started with when he asked me at one point on July 4th party, "How tall are you?" I said, 3 centimeters shorter than Peter the Great. Well, he burst out laughing. He thought that was marvelous. But from that time, I had an in with him. I don't want to exaggerate that, but when other reporters were kept totally away, I could at least get close enough to extend a microphone and pick up what it is that he was saying.
Yeah.
And time and again, he would say, here comes Peter the Great. We have to talk to him. And it was a wonderful opportunity for a journalist to get close enough to a very significant figure. Khrushchev himself, up close, was a man who could talk to you about basketball, also about how awful the West is and how you are determined to bring down the Soviet Union, and all we want is peace and all you want is war. And you could actually challenge him. You could go back and forth. And that to me was terrific. So really, to get to the heart of your question, in that period of time, as a journalist, I kept, with my wife urging me to do so, I kept all of my broadcasts. So when it came to writing the memoir, I had a daily report on exactly what it is that I was saying to the American people day after day. So writing this memoir was a function both of looking down at those documents, my broadcasts, memory. I happen to have a good memory. And also the experience, truly, what I had as a graduate student in the history department and what we used to call the Russian Research Center, which is currently the Davis Center.
Davis Center, yeah.
Right. And so for me, all of that contributed to this opportunity of recording this event.
Well, it's great to have you lay this out for us. And I think when people read the book, those of you who haven't yet gotten a chance to, I think what you'll appreciate, which I just love about it, is again this ability to both give us a very personal story, but also, in fact, illuminate this amazing period. It leads to this question, which is, I guess, about these two extraordinary figures, namely Khrushchev and Kennedy. You saw them up close in a way very few people did, maybe on the fingers of both hands. We might be able to name, or maybe, I don't know, one hand, but very few people had the kind of up close experience with the two of them that you did. And I guess the question I would ask is, Khrushchev's been in power for about 6 years, right? About 6 years-ish when Kennedy becomes president. And it's true, isn't it, that Khrushchev has real hopes for the relationship with Kennedy. Maybe talk just a little bit about what he expected, what he wanted from this young, somewhat untried, or very untried, president, who I think intrigued him, according to what you tell us and others have told us. Just maybe talk a little bit about Khrushchev on Kennedy, and then maybe a few words on the reverse, if you would.
Well, widen the screen just a second. What you find is that Khrushchev's vision of Kennedy was rooted in World War II. In World War II, most Russians who had half a brain recognized the enormous help that the United States was giving to the Soviet Union when it was under ferocious German attack. So there was a positive feeling about the US in his mind.
Yeah.
Second, he had the belief, which is part hubris and part misguided wisdom, that if he could sit down with an American president, he could accomplish miracles. There's no question about it. And people would say to him, including members of his family, Nikita, calm down, you know, the Americans have their interests and we have ours. Yes, I know, but if I could sit down with them. When the opportunity came to sit down with President Eisenhower, Geneva, 1954, he leaped at the opportunity. And out of it came this mysterious spirit of Geneva, and it amounted to nothing in the long run. But at that time, it inflamed in Khrushchev a greater desire to keep meeting with Eisenhower, and he'd do great things. Eisenhower didn't play his game. He met with Eisenhower 3 times, very disappointed with him. When he met Kennedy on a visit to the United States in August of '59, it was a very brief visit. It's kind of a handshake. How do you do? But in his mind was, wow, this is a very young senator. My goodness. Yeah. And then suddenly, a couple of months later, he's elected president. Yeah. At the beginning of 1961, when John Kennedy raised his hand and became president January 20th, Khrushchev had laid out in a speech he delivered several months earlier, but was published just before Kennedy took over, a speech about his judgment of the US-Soviet communist capitalist relationship. In his head was, I'm finished with Eisenhower. I couldn't get anywhere. But this young man, he's going to be something. And people said to him, and he would repeat it. I, in fact, heard it at one point. He used 3 words over and over again: young, weak, inexperienced. And if you put those 3 together in a calculating communist mind, you can see that written large was opportunity.
Yeah.
And when the Bay of Pigs happened in the springtime of 61, Khrushchev was telling people at that time, and it was reflected in all of the papers, Moscow radio, television, conversations with Soviet officials. Khrushchev couldn't understand how could someone who was the president of the United States allow that catastrophe to take place 90 miles off Florida. And in his mind, it reaffirmed certain concepts of weakness and experience.
Yeah.
But
And of course, I was just going to say, sorry to interrupt you, but I was going to say, Kennedy himself wondered, how could a president, that is to say, me, allow this to happen? So he shared, I think, a certain incredulity at what happened at the Bay of Pigs. But then we get to Vienna, Marvin, which you write about. And of course, it doesn't go well from Kennedy's perspective. It's often suggested that he was unprepared. I don't think that's quite right.
No.
John F. Kennedy prepared for these kinds of meetings. He understood how important this meeting was. But it's also fair to say that he was, to some extent, bullied, I think. That one has a bit more salience for me. But it just doesn't go well, and I guess it builds from what you've just said, which is to say Khrushchev's conclusions, both about Kennedy coming into office, but then also Bay of Pigs. He sees an opportunity at Vienna, this first summit between the summit between the two men, for those of you who don't know, in the spring of 61. He sees an opportunity there, right?
He sees an opportunity, but it is mixed with a hope.
Yeah.
That at this opportunity, which he wanted so much, he really worked very hard to get this summit with Kennedy. Kennedy wanted it too, but not as much as Khrushchev.
Yeah.
When he finally got it, they both arrived there with very high expectation, but they left in a state of considerable depression.
Yeah.
Kennedy had to build up the budget. He had to send more people to Berlin. He did a number of things which, from Khrushchev's point of view, represented a failure on his part to get what he wanted out of Kennedy. And there's a wonderful section in, which Fred, you know very well, and this has come up and it's been reported elsewhere, but it gives you a very good flavor of what it was like at the end of the summit. And I said, like a red light warning, the word miscalculation ignited an ugly exchange between the two leaders. And with only minutes to go before their final handshake, Kennedy again fell back on the danger of miscalculation. Unknown to us then, but officially disclosed many years later, Khrushchev erupted. Miscalculation, miscalculation, miscalculation. All I ever hear is that damn word, miscalculation. You ought to take that word and bury it in cold storage and never use it again. I'm sick of it. Losing his temper, which he often did when he felt trapped, Khrushchev exclaimed, if the US wants war, then so be it. Yeah. Kennedy paused before coolly replying, then it's going to be a cold winter. Now, we all know that anecdote, but the words convey the disappointment that Khrushchev felt and the cool response that Kennedy gave him. What is key to me, sort of studying Khrushchev at that time, was that in his mind was a confirmation of his earlier long-range impression of this young man, this inexperienced man, and this weak man. And he felt within 6 or 7 weeks later that he could take action on Berlin, which was the central, as his son Sergei would say, it was his nightmare. He would dream about that every night. He had to resolve that issue. And he took action on building the famous wall through Berlin. What was incredibly interesting, Fred, at that time was that Dan Shore in Berlin for CBS went into East Germany, and I went into different parts of Russia.
Hmm.
Then we shared our information, and what we learned, interestingly, was that Russian officials believed that if the United States, meaning if Kennedy had decided to knock the wall down, he'd have gotten away with it, and Khrushchev would not have been able to do anything because he realized at that point that he was weaker than the United States, and if it came to a war, he would lose, and he didn't want that at all. He was very frightened of nuclear war. He didn't want any war for that matter.
Yeah.
But he knocked down the wall and he got away with it. And that put the Cuba bug in his head.
Yeah. I want to come back to Cuba. I want to just go out of the chronology for a minute because I think it makes sense here. But and also because I don't want to miss this opportunity. Khrushchev's response to Dallas, November 1963, I think is quite stunning. And you write about this. He was distraught at the news from Dallas. And there are reports that he cried. He was certainly distraught. So by that point, and maybe I shouldn't take it out of chronology because I do want to come back to the missile crisis and I want to talk about some of the developments in the months after the missile crisis. But maybe you can just say a few words now and we can come back to it. This hit him hard when he heard about Kennedy's death because I think he sensed a different kind of opportunity. I think you write about this. Going forward with Kennedy, and that was now snatched. He didn't think he would have that same kind of opportunity with Johnson. Is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely, because what happened in September of 1963
Yeah.
was that the two leaders managed, in the horror nightmare of the Cuban Missile Crisis, they managed to step back and say to themselves, we've got to do something. And they reached agreement on an atmospheric nuclear test ban agreement,
Right.
September 1963. That exploded within Khrushchev, totally unrealistic, wild ideas and dreams. One of them was that with Kennedy, he would be able to reach agreements not only on nuclear arms, but on Berlin. He would reach agreement on a peace understanding between NATO and the Warsaw Pact.
Yeah.
He was filled with the belief that over the next 6 years, Kennedy would be, in his mind, Kennedy would be in office for another 2 years of his first term. Then he would win re-election, and then he'd be there for another 4 years. That would be another 6 years to make all of these great agreements.
Yeah.
And people would ask him, why 6 years? And he would say, well, 2 years he finishes this, 4 years he's got it next. And he said, we're going to do really great things. On the day that Kennedy was shot, he was at his dacha outside of Moscow. And often before dinner, he would go for a walk. He came back with his security people from this walk back into the house. And just before dinner, the phone from the Kremlin rang. He picked it up and was informed that Kennedy was shot. Not that he was dead, but shot. He was stunned. He called Gromyko, foreign minister, and he said, call Dobrynin in Washington. Double check that. That may not be true. Gromyko assumed it was true, called, got word, yes, it was, called back to Khrushchev, and Khrushchev, according to his son, later wept because he felt that this romantic dream that he had, that he would do great things with Kennedy, could now never happen.
It's extraordinary. And again, is so vividly rendered in the book. Let's talk a little bit about the missile crisis. I want to, if we have time at the end, I want to come back to 1963 because it's just an extraordinary year in this particular story, and you develop it. But we should. There's so much interest still in the missile crisis, and rightly so. I wonder. And by the way, folks, I forgot to say at the top, if you have a question that you'd like to pose to Marvin, you can put it in the chat. Caroline will help us with that if you have any sort of issues with that. But please go ahead and do that. But in the missile crisis, talk to us a little bit. Give us a sense of the following. In the hours after Kennedy informed the country and the world about the existence of the crisis, I guess we could say, which is the 22nd of October, a Monday. For many, we think of this as the 13 days, but I think for much of the world, it was really about 7 days. We should think of it as a shorter crisis in terms of how most of the world perceived this. But the next morning, and you write about this, the next morning in Moscow, so Tuesday, there's just deep, deep concern about what this means. For folks who haven't yet read the book, give us a sense of that mood, if you would, Marvin.
Sure. It was already deep into the night when we could listen in Moscow to what Kennedy was saying in that 7 p.m. broadcast Monday evening. And it was that there would now be a quarantine around Cuba and no Russian ship can get through it. In Moscow, what we did not know, we could not know, was that Tuesday morning, Khrushchev immediately put out an order not to challenge the quarantine. So immediately, as you look back upon it, immediately you had a sense that this was a guy, whoops, I may be going a bit too far here. Hang on. Yeah. So that was the first step. On Tuesday night of that week, I've got to tell you this story because it ends up giving you much more a flavor of Khrushchev, and you ought to know this. Tuesday night, my wife, a dear, magnificent woman, had tickets to the opera. I told her, there's no way I could leave the office. We're in the middle of this incredible crisis. I'm staying here. You can go to the opera. She says, no, you're going with me. And, I've done that all of my life. We've been married 67 years now.
We do this. We listen when our spouses speak. Yes.
So we went. The lights go down in the Bolshoi Theater, and immediately on the right, the light hits, and Khrushchev is there with 4 members of his Politburo, including Mrs. Khrushchev, who normally would not go to these events. And I was saying to myself, I had a seat there in the 4th row, and I'm looking over and I'm saying to myself, how smart of you to go to the opera tonight. And the opera that night was Boris Godunov and the great American singer Jerome Hines was singing it in Russian. Khrushchev led 4 standing ovations when the opera was finished, picked himself up, went around the back, and with Mehdi, I ran after him. And again, because of that Peter the Great connection, his security people let me through. And I found myself with Khrushchev, who was saying, wow, thank you to Jerome Hines. So there were 6 of us there. And Khrushchev says to Hines, you've done a great thing for the Russian people. You have made America a great artist for America. We're happy to see an American artist here. I said, sir, we're in the middle of a great crisis now. Do you believe we can get out of this without war? Looked at me, yes. I said, do you believe both sides are interested now in a peaceful resolution of this crisis? He looked at me and he said, if people want peace, they can get it. I said, do they want to get it? Yes. Bingo, I had a hell of a story. And wow. And that was Tuesday night. Wednesday morning, there was Bertrand Russell, who had done a speech Tuesday in London, saying, let's have a summit meeting. It was all over Pravda, the big paper, and Khrushchev went out and praised Bertrand Russell, praised the idea of an agreement, of a summit meeting. On Thursday, the UN Secretary General picked it up and said, again, let's have a summit meeting. Khrushchev grabbed it. The problem zone came in Friday and Saturday when there was an exchange of letters, Khrushchev and Kennedy.
Yep.
And the first Khrushchev letter was a wild one. At that time, of course, we in the press in Moscow we were not given copies of the letter, but we could talk to people. And a lot of them were terribly frightened, and some of them were challenging Khrushchev's wisdom. And at this time, they still did not know officially that Russia had moved missiles and 50,000 troops into Cuba.
Yeah.
That came up only sort of by accident on Saturday. And on Sunday, the big day, a quick summary. I spent the morning, I had a broadcast at 3 in the afternoon, 8-hour difference between Moscow and Washington. I went to the Central Marketplace where I used to go 3-4 times a week. Why? Because it gave me my only opportunity to talk to Russians, find out what is on their minds. I wanted to know whether they thought a war with Cuba was something worthwhile, and almost uniformly, Russians would say to me that a big no on Cuba, no war, not worth it.
Yeah.
They added, if you challenged us on Berlin, that there might be.
So
let me just finish this, the end of this.
Yeah.
I go back to the Central Telegraph, my 3 o'clock broadcast. I do that story about the Russian people, their reaction. I bump into a Russian reporter who doesn't want to talk to me, but I forced him to. And I said, what are you writing about? What are you writing about? He said, that's not your business. I said, but why are you here? Not your business. I said, what's going on? And he whispered, 5 o'clock, Levitan. I said, Levitan? You mean Yuri Levitan, the great broadcaster? He didn't answer, he ran away. I got on the phone to New York and I said, I can't promise you anything, but at 5 o'clock, we better have a live line to New York from here. And at that time, we arranged for the 5 o'clock broadcast to be taped in New York. On a separate line, I would do a translation of what it is that was coming through in Russian into New York. They would lay my translation on top of the Russian, if there was any news in it at all.
Yeah.
At the very beginning, at 5 o'clock, I heard the voice of Yuri Levitan. I knew there was something big, and he began to read the Khrushchev letter to Kennedy, in which he said, I have it here, but I won't put, in which he said, he has now given the order to put in crates the missiles that we had moved there, that Kennedy regarded as offensive, he said, and we're moving our people out. We are crating them up and moving them out. And on my line to New York, I shouted, he just caved. The crisis has passed. And we had obviously a hell of a scoop. The scoop lasting about 3 seconds. It was picked up by everything. But that was, I mean, for a journalist to be in the middle of a piece of history, that's heaven on earth.
Well, and you're getting a sense, folks, as Marvin is speaking about why, even if you've read a lot about the missile crisis, because this is how I felt in this section of the book, and I'm obviously researching this for my Kennedy biography. But I've also read a lot of the literature that's out there. There's more to be said about all of this, but you get a sense just in the last 5 minutes about what Marvin is able to bring on the page. I have one quick question more about the missile crisis, and I want to go back to the 22nd of October. Kennedy has an extraordinary conversation with Dwight Eisenhower that afternoon, his predecessor, which I play for the students. In fact, I'm going to put, while you're answering my question, I'll put a link to this conversation in the chat for those of you who are interested, because you can listen. Because of the White House tapes, all of us, the world, can listen to a lot of these conversations, not just ex-com conversations, but in this case, Kennedy and his predecessor. But the question for you, Marvin, is what's clear from that conversation and from other conversations that Kennedy had is that he's very concerned about Berlin, and that he says at one point to Eisenhower in that conversation, if we move to take out the missiles, they're going to respond on Berlin.
Berlin. Yeah.
So I guess just say, and it can just be a minute or two. We don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but Berlin obviously is very important to both men, even though this is in proximate terms for people who don't know the full history. In proximate terms, this is about Cuba. But for both of them, it's also about Berlin.
It's about Berlin because for Khrushchev, the central issue that absorbed him every day, as I said earlier, his son said that he had this nightmare of Berlin constantly. He believed that Berlin represented the assault from the West, the assault from the Hun, the assault from the Teuton. This is unacceptable. We are now communists. We're great. You can't mess with us. Kennedy understood that. And that was the wonderful thing about Kennedy. He understood the central issue driving his principal opponent. Now, he thought about that. And as you know better than anyone, really, the meetings that he had with the military people, we didn't know anything about that in Moscow. I was giving only the understanding, the point of view of, let me say, an informed Western observer of what was going on. But the central issue was Berlin. I know that there's a lot of people, many people, who disagree with that. And I would love to take them on right now. But that is my view.
Yeah. Well, and what I'm about to do here, people, is to put this. I put this link in the chat for folks, because I do think that this is an extraordinary conversation between the two of them. Let's see if that worked. We'll see. So we don't have many minutes. We're going to turn to questions from the audience, but I do want to talk about the title of the book. Have you talk about the title of the book? Because it connects us to, it has the contemporary resonance. It's really about, shall we say, a later Russia. Talk to us about the title and what it means.
What it meant to me when I was thinking about what to call the book was Khrushchev and Kennedy, Khrushchev, Kennedy, collision course, and all of that. No. What is central is that at that time, there was a leader in the Soviet Union who had the guts to take on the legend of Joseph Stalin in his famous secret speech of February 1956. He then had the guts to back out of, and do it publicly, to back out of the blunder that he himself had committed in Cuba. And it seemed to me that there was a connection to where we are today with Putin, another Russian leader. Now, the question is, are all Russian leaders alike? They're all driven by the same history, the same national interest. Why would one go to the Bolshoi Ballet and honor an American in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis? Why would Khrushchev welcome American artists and dancers and all kinds of Western figures, and for he himself to visit the West as often as he could? He was a modern reincarnation of Peter the Great. There are different rulers of Russia. Putin represents the Stalinist, Mongol-rooted origin of Russian history, and he believes that only he has the wisdom to lead the country. And Russia today is not opening itself to the West. It has closed itself from the West. And for that reason, and particularly the way that concept resonates with Russian people, with Russian history, literature, I think profoundly, and I believe we're in a very dangerous period. I'd be happy to talk about reasons why, but the principal reason is that you have a Russian leader like Putin and not a Russian leader like Khrushchev. It is a different Russia.
It's a different Russia, and therefore the title is so very apt. My last question is a historian's question, and then we will turn to, we have some questions that have come in that I want to pose to you from folks. This is a historian's question, which is a question one can think of as structure versus agency. And I guess as you reflect on your career and also what you're writing about, well, let's focus on this period, though of course you could take it any way you want, Marvin. But how much of the story that you're talking about here is about human agency? Individuals, maybe two of them in particular here, really shaping events. And how much of this is beyond their control, that it's really the Cold War is really more a story of structure, impersonal forces driving what happens, which of course is something that we as historians grapple with all the time. But you're in a position to reflect on this. And one way to address it, I guess, is to think counterfactually, as we sometimes do. If Nixon becomes president, as he almost did, he lost by a hair. If he becomes president in January of 1961, if, let's say, I don't know, Kuznetsov or somebody else in the Kremlin hierarchy leads the Soviet Union, my sense is that you're going to tell us, and I think I would agree with you, that we have a different story. But maybe say just a few words about this structure versus agency.
Well, we do have a different story because it was someone like Khrushchev who had the guts to take on the Stalin legacy, but also the guts, the foolishness, the utter stupidity of moving 50,000 troops, all of those missiles, nuclear warheads, from all over the bases of the Soviet Union into the Black Sea, through the Mediterranean, across the Atlantic, and assume that no one would have seen it. I mean, that's the first bit of, not exactly wisdom, but he had that impetuousness. He wanted something done, and he was driven to do it. And I'm certain, though I was not in the room with him, obviously, but if the military said, "Sir, we don't think this is a great idea," he would have said, "The heck with you, we're doing it anyway." Somebody else in a position of leadership, I believe, would not have been foolish enough to move missiles and troops into Cuba. That was America's backyard. You don't mess with them. We can do things in Germany. That's what they did think. We can work out some things. Vietnam was at that point just starting up, and they didn't know quite how to handle it. They could have done something there. They could have done something in Laos. There was a Laos conference. There were all kinds of things going on. There was the big operation in the Congo, the killing of Lumumba. What it is that Khrushchev then had to pull forces back? No. What you were getting at a moment ago, Fred, is so central in my judgment as a reporter, a kind of historian, but basically a journalist, looking at personalities. I traveled around the Middle East with Henry Kissinger during the shuttle diplomacy. I believe that if Kissinger were a blue-eyed, white, Christian Secretary of State, he probably couldn't have pulled it off. The fact that he was Jewish led the Arabs to think of him in a certain way, and certainly led Golda Meir to think of him in a certain way. And the personality in that negotiation was central.
Yeah.
And I think that the point you're raising about the importance of the personality as opposed to the large historic, the historic currents are going to be there. The personalities are not. They just come along. And I believe profoundly that personality is central to what is happening in history.
Yeah, well, I so agree with you, and I'll come back to the missile crisis for a second, and then I'm going to go to a question here from Tom Herman that's come in that I want to pose to you. But I'll just make that as a comment, which is, you could argue that the Cuban Missile Crisis is really the finest hour for both of these men. Their insistence on finding a political solution and rejecting the advice of more hawkish advisors. You could talk about Dobrynin on the Soviet side and Kuznetsov on the Soviet side, much of the ex-com for much of this crisis. And what's funny is that their finest hour arguably follows their worst hour.
Yeah.
You've already talked about the recklessness of Khrushchev, but you could say also that Kennedy, in terms of Operation Mongoose, the efforts to destabilize the Cuban government, overthrow Castro, it's funny how those things go together. And in both instances, it seems to me, personalities, as you point out, really matter. Here's a question from Tom Herman. Marvin, how and why did Khrushchev allow his memoirs to be published in the West? And how did journalists gain access to those memoirs?
Well, remember, Khrushchev was kicked out of power on October 14th, 1964.
Yeah.
But he was kicked out of power in a very Khrushchevian way. They didn't send him off to Siberia or kill him or kill his family. They treated him quite well. Yeah. They gave him a dacha, they gave him a car, they gave him a driver, they gave him money, and they didn't hound him. And what he did, because he was, as I said earlier, he was a very talkative, demonstrative, eager person. He wanted to talk to people. He's an old man sitting on a farm outside of Moscow. He doesn't have anyone to talk to, so he laid out his memoirs. And his son helped him, other people helped him, and suddenly he had in front of him very valuable stuff. At that time, coincidentally, a number of American reporters, Jerry Schechter of Time magazine, had a conversation with Sergei, the son. There was another Russian, and I'm blocking him right now, the name, but he was also terribly important again. And he was in contact with the West, and they came to Kissinger with a deal. You give us your book, we're going to publish it all over the world in exactly your words. And he thought about that, not for a long time. And he said, let's go. And that is the way that happened.
Mm. Tell me this. Talk a little bit about Khrushchev's downfall. You know, it really happens, what, about 2 years after the missile crisis, about a year after Kennedy's death. You write about how he tried to bring reforms to the system, I guess maybe with some modest success. Maybe you want to say a word or two about that. But I can't help, Marvin, when I read the book, I have a certain affinity for Khrushchev that I think you bring out, and that maybe in part because of the comparison, as you pointed out earlier, to a different Russia that we have today. But I don't know, reflect a little bit on his demise. You can answer it as follows, or address the following. If he had done X, Y, or Z, would he have survived? Was he naive in thinking that he wasn't under challenge? Give us a few words on that, if you would.
Fred, he was definitely under challenge, and he underestimated it time and time again. He was told by his son and daughter, several weeks before he was actually ousted.
That's right.
Dear Dad, or dear Father, we hear that people like Brezhnev are beginning to think bad thoughts about you. People are beginning to be unhappy about you. Khrushchev brushed them aside. He said, that is ridiculous. He wouldn't accept the idea that he was being kicked out. Let me just read you, if you don't mind, one quick.
Yeah, please.
No, this will give you a sense of what was going on. They insisted, Khrushchev was down at the Black Sea taking it easy for a couple of weeks. Brezhnev called him and said, we want you to come back to a meeting tomorrow. Khrushchev said, nonsense. I'm going to stay here for my vacation. Brezhnev says something he would never have said. He said, no, going to come back tomorrow. And Khrushchev got on a plane. When he arrived in Moscow, he expected there to be a delegation of Soviet officials to welcome him. There was nobody at the airport.
Nobody was there.
No delegation. Without ceremony, he was driven directly to the Kremlin. Though puzzled, Khrushchev took his seat at the head of a long table, glancing right and left from one familiar face to another. Then, with a show of irritation, Khrushchev opened the meeting, demanding to know why he had been summoned to Moscow. Who? Why? It was left to Brezhnev to provide the answer. Hearing it, Khrushchev was stunned, his mouth open in shock and surprise. A reborn Brezhnev let loose with a blistering attack on Khrushchev's domestic and foreign policy, charging the once untouchable Soviet leader with making decisions on his own, ignoring his colleagues, behaving incomprehensibly, acting unilaterally. Khrushchev took a moment and then, choosing his words carefully, tried to explain, admitting that of course he'd made mistakes, but surely his friends understood. You have no friends here, interjected one friend. You listen to us for a change, barked another friend. Instead of the Stalin cult, hissed still another, we have the cult of Khrushchev. Everyone had had a chance to vent his anger and displeasure. Brezhnev, clearly acting as the new leader, reminded his colleagues that it was Khrushchev who once described them as male dogs peeing on curbstones. Then, bluntly, without apology or explanation, Brezhnev demanded Khrushchev's immediate resignation. Though shocked, Khrushchev raised no fuss. He asked no questions.
That's right.
He just quietly signed an already prepared letter of resignation, thus ending an extraordinary period in modern Russian history.
Well, and I mean, the line that you just read about a minute ago, you have no friends here, said one friend. It's just a marvelous line. But that thank you for that, because that part of the book, which I read just last night, late last night, is an extraordinary, it's an amazing small section in this very dramatic moment. And I think you captured so well. Here's a question from a name that will be familiar. Paul Kalb.
Oh, yes.
Asks the following question. Today, we have vastly more information about Russia than we did 60 years ago. But no one with the kind of personal connection you had with Khrushchev and other individual Russians. What are the implications, Paul asks, what are the implications of this loss of connectivity? And what are the risks?
Well, the risks, thank you, Paul, for the question, as always, right to the heart of an issue. The risks to me are enormous. We don't have reporters in Russia anymore, and that is not the reporters' fault. It is because they don't want to be arrested. And Putin has made it very, very clear that you report nastily about me, and you're in trouble, and you're going to get either arrested, have a car accident, something horrible could happen. And so responsibly, editors and producers pull their reporters out of Moscow. What is the effect? The effect is that there are very few Western reporters now in Moscow or anywhere in that vast country. Do we really know what is happening there? We do not. We have flights over Russia, and we look down and we see things, but we don't know. We don't have what Ambassador Bolin did with me. We don't have people out on the street talking to Russians, finding out what they think, what they feel. And because we don't have that, we are asking for miscalculation. Remember that word I was saying before when they met in Vienna? Miscalculation. There is now a golden opportunity for miscalculation. If Putin puts out the word, I may use nuclear weapons. I may use a nuclear weapon. Oh, come on, don't play games with nuclear weapons. But he's playing games because he thinks he knows the cowardly Western leaders will not do anything to take him on, that he'll be able to get away with the Ukrainian adventure. Oh no, Paul, I think that we are at a dangerous time because there is little hard information that comes out of Russia, and we're sort of guessing. We're guessing. We can't guess.
Yeah. Well, and you know, it was an extraordinary revelation, at least for me, in well, at least in part in Bob Woodward's book. Although there may have been other sources for this too, Marvin, but when we learned that the Biden administration determined that there was a 50-50 chance that Putin would decide to use tactical nuclear weapons. 50-50 is a flip of the coin.
Exactly.
That's an extraordinary bit of intelligence, which I'm sure was carefully reached by the highest levels of U.S. intelligence. I mean, it's a stunning development. And of course, related to this is that with respect to China, which we haven't talked about today, and we won't, but you know, the New York Times, for example, used to have a very large bureau with lots of journalists, and there are far fewer correspondents on the ground in a very large country. So this is not just a Russia thing.
No, it is not. And it is, that's why I am very antsy, very uncertain about where we are today. I look at the fact that 12,000 North Korean troops have been moved in to fight against the Ukrainians now. Okay. You can look at that and simply say, well, the Russians don't want to lose their own people fighting Ukrainians, so they bring in an ally. No. If you're sitting in the Kremlin right now and you have to depend on North Koreans to help out us Russians, no. Who made that decision? I believe there are questions like that being asked now because of that fact. The Russians are not wide open democratic people when it comes to other people with yellow skin. They simply are not good on issues of that sort. They don't like the Chinese, and they sure as heck don't like the Koreans. But to depend upon them is to take a step into a big danger zone.
I agree with you. We have about a minute, Marvin, and we have a huge question that you can give a one-sentence answer to. I have my own answer to this question, but I'll let you handle it in a few words, and that is, it has been suggested that we came very close to war in October, nuclear war in October of 1962, extremely close. Is that your understanding? Or are you saying that Khrushchev would not have allowed it? Can you give us your brief answer to that one?
In fact, Khrushchev did not allow it. However, on the basis of my memory about where we were that day in Russia, there was a feeling. Now, when you say, what is that based on? It was a feeling based on my experience by talking to people. You could not continue to go on day after day with that kind of a mess, and that Kennedy would have had to take military action against Cuba probably on that Monday morning. And therefore, if it had not broken as it did on Sunday, I think the world would have experienced, I think they would have experienced a nuclear war.
Yeah, and I agree with you based on my research in terms of the pressure that Kennedy was under. I'm very glad you mentioned that because that's something we should bear in mind. Well, folks, we're at the end of our time, and with apologies to those who wanted to get into the conversation, huge thanks to you, Marvin, in particular. And let me just encourage folks once again to head down to your local bookstore. If you have them in your neighborhood, and pick up this amazing book. But thanks to you, Marvin, in particular.
Thank you very much, Fred. Appreciate it immensely. Thank you.
All right. Good night, everyone. Take care.